Autumn Sky. I'm a visionary artist from British Columbia, Canada, and I work mainly in acrylic. Through the journey of getting to know acrylic, I've really made friends with it. It gives me so much freedom and play, and so my purpose here today is to put some new tools in your tool belt and to really empower you on your journey so that you can play and experiment and really have fun with this versatile medium. This by no means is the only way. You'll see that there are a million different ways that you can approach this and just enjoy the process. So thanks so much for joining me. Let's begin. All right, so to begin, I'd like to introduce you to some of the tools and supplies that we're going to be working with here in acrylic painting. If you're familiar with acrylic, a lot of the time we just use the paint out of the tube. This is a pretty heavy-bodied acrylic, and if you work thin like I do, then you probably find that you're spending a lot of effort thinning it down with water in order to get nice, thin, transparent layers. And I've really found that the golden fluid acrylics already are at a viscosity that's lovely to work with. It's really the difference between working with peanut butter versus maple syrup. This is really, really nice, creamy texture, and it's also been thinned without diluting the pigment and opacity. So it's just very, very to the point. So I've actually been transitioning over pretty fully and getting all of my paint palette now into the fluids. They come in beautiful colors. So I really encourage you to try them if you haven't before, and I assure you that you will probably really like it if you do work in those thin layers. If you are just wanting to experiment with them, try the titanium white to begin with. It's really will revolutionize a lot of your highlighting. And they come in various sizes, so you can just try them out in the smaller bottles. I also use a glazing medium, so I'll use a combination of water and glazing medium, which is pretty much paint with no pigment in it. So if you think of any kind of paint as being minerals and pigment mixed with a binder of some kind. So in oil, it would be linseed oil. In acrylic, it's a polymer varnish material. And so this is thinned down a little bit, but this is a glazing medium. So it looks creamy white, but it actually will dry totally clear. And so when I use this in combination with water, it helps keep the integrity of the paint intact so that as you're distributing all these little microscopic pebbles of mineral across the surface of the canvas, it's keeping the strength of the binder so that they're not able to be rubbed off by your cloth or your brush coming over top of it. So I do use a combination of both, and you'll see later in the process that sometimes it's called for more water and sometimes called for more glazing medium. But it just sort of depends, and you'll get to know what texture you like, and you'll see the effects of too little or too much glazing medium. But that glazing medium, it's shiny when it dries, and don't get hung up on the sheen of your canvas as you're working. You can totally neutralize that with any kind of varnish at the end, but just keep in mind that it does dry a little bit shiny, and it dries a little bit faster, which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive as to what you would assume, but it does dry faster, so it's not going to slow the drying time. It just is going to really give you that nice layer of paint that will give depth to your layers as you're building them up. I've tried a lot of different glazing medium, and by far my favorite is the Liquitex glazing medium. You can experiment with different mediums. There's a million out there. Acrylic paint has just been blowing up and transforming and evolving at a rapid pace. You can get any kind of medium these days, so really play with it and experiment. But for example, sorry it's not in the bottle here, but you can see a lot of different brands produce something that would look the same according to the bottle, but I really assure you that the Liquitex glazing medium is superior, even to the Golden, which I love Golden brand. So that's a really nice one. It just is very, very smooth and slick without being chalky. Though it is a little bit white, so keep in mind as you mix it with your paint, it's going to lighten the color of your paint ever so slightly. So just keep that in mind, and we're going to talk about that a lot, about how acrylic paint is lighter when it's wet and dries slightly darker, which is a world of annoyance, but something that you're just going to work with, so it's not a problem. Just expect it. Have a little rinse tub, something with a nice stable bottom. I just often will keep these. It's a great way to recycle to-go containers or olive tubs or anything like that. And it's tempting to fill your water all the way up. It's really not necessary though. And if you think of a paintbrush, this metal area at the bottom is actually what's designed to be in the water. So if you try to keep your water, this is even a little bit full, keep your water below that so that you're not actually soaking the wood, you're only soaking the metal. And this is going to help you take care of your brushes a lot longer. They're going to serve you a lot better. If you're not soaking that wood, which is going to bloat the wood, it's going to crack the paint, and it's just going to be sort of gross to hold after a while. So don't fill your water jug too full. You can just keep refreshing it. So keep that handy. Also, I like to use cotton sheets. So I'll go to the thrift store. I'll get some nice cotton, usually white, just so that I can see the paint on it. I like to be able to know if I'm about to smear phthalo blue across my canvas or something like that. So get some sheets and cut them. I usually cut them into this very precise, haggard looking square, but something about 8 inches by 8 inches is, I find, really nice. And I often will keep this. I'll paint a lot of my painting with a cloth in my left hand. It just makes my left hand feel like it's being useful, which is nice, but it also is just really handy. And we're going to talk about techniques with not using too much paint on your brush. This is going to be your new best friend. If you're not familiar with a Stay Wet palette, this will save you a lot of paint. It's going to save a lot of dinner plates. It's amazing to see how many practicing artists use dinner plates as palettes, and these are amazing. It's pretty much a Tupperware container. Inside is a cellulose sponge. I've already soaked this with water so you can see it's wet. It's a cellulose sponge, and on top of it is an acrylic porous paper. And what this does is when you saturate it with water and you put your paint on top, it allows the water to wick up through into the base of the paint, and it keeps it moist for a very long time. And that, in combination with a little spritzer bottle just on top of the paint before you close it, is going to make your paint last a long time. This is going to save you paint. It's going to save scraping dried paint into the garbage. It's also going to make it a lot easier for color mixing, because when you come back to a painting the next day or later after your paint is dried, you can open your palette and see what color that paint was when it was wet, and you'll see it on your palette and you'll be able to work with it from that wet point. And it also just sort of lowers the pressure of painting in general. So often if it's a big effort to pull out your paint supplies and start a fresh palette, a lot of the time, if we only have an hour to do so, we just won't bother. You know, it's easier to scroll on Facebook or do whatever. But if you have your paints already laid out, you just open your palette and they're right there for you. So these are great. I use them all the time. Often if I'm working on a bigger canvas, I'll use 2 of these. This is called the Handy palette. This is the smallest size it comes in. It's made by Mastersons. So sometimes I'll use one of these for cool colors and one of them for warm colors, and actually use 2, but they do come in fabulous big sizes as well, which I'll show you here. Look at that. Dreamy. Huge. So if you work large, you might want to invest in a nice big Stay Wet palette. And you can buy more paper and sponges for them. You're going to want to saturate that sponge pretty well, and you can keep them going pretty long. I let them go probably longer than I should for health and safety reasons, because they get pretty pretty funky, but they really are awesome, and they're durable. So you can save a lot of paint, and you'll love that. My brushes that I use typically, I like square brushes. I also like short handles so I don't poke myself in the eye. And I like to get pretty close to my canvas sometimes. So it's, I just find that they work for me. If you prefer long handles, by all means, there's beautiful long handle brushes out there, and you might just prefer that weight in your hand. Totally up to you. It's a personal choice, absolutely. Anything I say here is just going to very much be from my own experience, and only by experimenting are you going to find truly what works for you and your unique creative process. So just keep that in mind, and I'll tell you what I think and take it or leave it. But I really like these square brushes. I also really like the white nylon. So I find it just has the perfect compromise between flex and rigidity. It's a nice, supple brush while still being able to hold its shape. So they start all pristine and beautiful like this. And like I said with the water, if you can care for your tools, these brushes will last you pretty well. So when it comes to points like this, nice round brushes, if you take care of this point, even though it's a 4, it's a pretty big brush, you can get almost all the detail you need from this. You can definitely go down to tiny little brushes, but this has such a fine point that if you care for this, you will be able to get a lot of detail. And leaving it in your water is just going to bend it. So really keeping in mind as you're working, especially when you're in that creative flow and you might not be paying attention to how you're handling your tools, just try to keep it in mind. And I am definitely guilty of leaving my brushes in the water. I'm still learning this, and you will continue to learn it as well, I'm sure. But not leaving your brushes in the water is going to really help them last. Again, it comes down to bloating that wood and cracking the paint, as well as packing paint into the base of the brushes and bending the bristles. However, inevitably, you're going to be wearing out your brushes, and this by no means is going to mean that they are dead to you. In fact, some of my favorite brushes are ones that I've really thrashed on. So you can see these ones started all pristine and lovely like this, and eventually they just get frayed. The bristles, the paint packs into the base of the bristles, which is forcing the bristles apart, and they no longer lay flat and smooth, but now they actually have quite a width to them in all directions. And they're just soft. And so I'm going to use this a lot later in the process with scumbling, which is doing this kind of action on the surface of the canvas. And you're going to find that this is really useful in a lot of different phases of the painting. Any kind of hazing or smoke or clouds, you're going to use it a lot. So just sort of using your brushes at every point. Every time you go to the art supply store, maybe, treat yourself to a new little brush and know that they're all cycling through. And when they get beyond recognition, then they become brushes for glue or something like that, and then they're done. Or you can turn them into craft projects, spray paint them gold and make a little figurine around it or something, get crafty. But they really can be useful at every stage. So don't get too hung up on it, but do keep in mind they're expensive. Each one of these brushes might be between $2 and $8. So just taking care of them is going to save you money, and it's going to save garbage, and just really try to treat them well, and they will treat you well. Also, chalk. If I can impart 2 things to you that are my best friends in this creative process, that I assure you will also become your best friends, it is this handy palette and chalk, like good old children's Crayola chalk. Mostly white is really what you're going to find use for. In acrylic painting, it can be really freeing and really fun to play with chalk when your paint is dry on the surface of your canvas. It can be a great way to brainstorm, and I'll show this later in the process, but you'll see that you can do a lot of planning and sketching and brainstorming with the chalk, and not at all affect the surface of the paint or the color of the paint. You can simply take a cloth, a little bit damp, and wipe it away and it will totally disappear. That being said, do beware of colored chalk. I like the brown chalk, so I'll just get boxes of the colored Crayola chalk. But anything like a green or a blue or a yellow does have a lot of dye in it. So you might find that at certain points you need that colored chalk just to show up on a light surface. But do keep in mind that it does have a lot of dye, so it will affect the color of your paint as you're painting over it. Whereas the white, you can paint right over that. It's not going to affect at all the color of your paint. So often if I use colored chalk at all, I'll just dab off the excess powder with my cloth. Or if I know I'm painting in blue tones, I'll use blue chalk and that kind of idea. But in general, I do try to tone my canvas at least slightly so that I can work with white chalk because I just prefer it, I trust it, and I know it's not going to taint the color of my paint and create weird reactions of color. If you are working finer, these Stabilo pencils are really great. They are water soluble and they can write on any surface. They're fabulous in that way. They are packed a little bit harder than the chalk. This is packed so soft that you barely need to touch the canvas to leave a line. Whereas these you got to scrub a little bit. So these I only use when I need to do detail planning and it's precise. I don't do any brainstorming with these because you can scratch the surface of your canvas and your paint, and it just is unnecessary. So use the stubby chalk. You can sharpen this in a pencil sharpener and make it nice and pointy. But it's just, you're going to find that this is just really friendly to the surface of your canvas, whereas any kind of watercolor pencil or chalk pencil or the Stabilos, they're just packed tighter so they can scratch your painting. Just beware of that. In general, really try to avoid using pencil on your canvas, using Conte or charcoal. I find that these, unless you're sealing them with like a spray fixative, they have this sneaky way of rising to the surface of your paint, no matter how many layers of paint you put on there. So unless you're being very precise with them, again, like the Stabilos, and you're just doing very precise layout, they can be useful, but I really would just encourage you in general to avoid Conte charcoal and pencil on the surface of your canvas because it's remarkable how it just keeps raising. Having a little spritzer bottle is great. Sometimes I'll use it just like this, barely pulling it, and you can create great textures with that, and we'll talk about that when we're laying in a background. But generally I'm using it to spritz my canvas or to create dripping textures on my canvas. And mostly it's for my palette. It's for keeping those paints wet, especially if you're painting outside. The Stay Wet palette is going to be really helpful for keeping your paints from drying in the sun, and a spritzer bottle handy is going to also help with that. So every time I'm stepping away from my canvas or in my painting station, I'll just give it a very light misting with the spritzer bottle and close this up, and it will literally last months if you don't open it. It might not smell great, but it will last a long time. And you can just keep it going. You can also just rinse that paper inside and start a new paper. It will be stained, and as your brushes will too. Just keeping in mind that, you know, as these brushes get worn, they're going to be stained, but they're still very, very useful. And you know, they take on their own character. That's fun. Having a sketchbook handy at all times is just a good practice. So it doesn't need to be big, it doesn't need to be fancy. In fact, the less fancy it is, the more prone you are to drawing in it in general. I don't know how many people I've talked to, and I've experienced this, of getting beautiful new sketchbooks and thinking, I'm going to sketch every day. And it's so beautiful, you don't want to wreck it with your drawings. So sometimes the most effective sketchbooks I've had have just actually been little newsprint folders. But I really like these little ones that I can put in my purse or take around with me, and it's just a really low pressure sketchbook. So I can use that for brainstorming, and often I find that most of my ideas actually come while I'm painting. So just keeping a sketchbook handy while you're painting can be a really good practice for documenting those ideas as they come. Picasso said, "Inspiration does exist, but it must find you working." So keeping that in mind, as you are in the creative process, you're opening the channel of creativity through you as you work. And so not all the ideas that come are going to be about the painting you're working on. A lot of them are just going to be epiphanies about life and living and love and the metaphors of existence, but they're going to be also a lot about just other paintings to work on. And that inspiration will just flow more and more as you sink deeper into the creative process. So keep something handy to document those ideas because they're very valuable. They're a great gift. Also, as you unwrap your shiny new canvas that you're about to paint on, you'll find all of this very helpful plastic. So before you just jump to conclusions and throw that in the garbage or the recycle if you're environmentally responsible, use this. It's really handy. And so we're going to talk about that as we get into the texturing of the canvas. You can use it late into the process, but it can create very interesting textures on the surface of the canvas just by scrunching and dabbing or laying over it, letting it dry a little bit and peeling it back, creating decalcomania textures. It's really, really fun. So use any of these things. In fact, look in your recycling and see if there's different things that you can use to create textures and to use as brushes or paint tubs. There's really art supplies everywhere you look. You don't need to be rich to make art. You can find supplies and work with what you have at any point. When you lay out your palette, it's very tempting to lay out all the colors, especially if you're familiar with working in oils. A lot of the time you lay out your whole palette of colors so that you can draw from them. Acrylic, because it does dry a lot faster, it really behooves you to actually just be very selective about your colors and think of it more like a buffet. You can always go back for more. So just using small amounts is going to save you, again, it's going to save you a lot of paint, it's going to save you a lot of mess on your palette, and you really don't need all your colors. If you lay out the full rainbow every painting you do, you might notice that all your paintings become rainbows. So working in a limited palette can be a really good practice. It can be, it's sort of about stretching into the freedom of limitation. It's sort of this oxymoron, but it can be really a good practice to just try to rein in that tendency of working with all your colors. And so that when you do add a contrasting color, it can create a lot of emphasis and interest. So if you are working at all in these fluid acrylics, you're going to notice when you squeeze them on your palette, they do tend to run. So again, keeping your palette level as you're moving it around your studio or elsewhere is going to keep them from making a big mess. You can also use these little tubs if you feel like you want to keep a certain color, especially white. Maybe you want to keep very pristine. So often I'll just put a little bit of the white paint into one of these tubs. Again, not too much. I can always go back for more, and this will inevitably get other colors mixed into it if I'm just not really paying attention and I have color on my paintbrush as I'm dipping, so it can get tainted. So try not to be wasteful with these paints. They will always, they're going to stay the cleanest in their tube. So I'll put a little bit of white in there. Also, these are great for the glazing medium, just to keep it nice and clean, because I don't want that glazing medium to go all over the palette, but I do want to keep it handy. So just putting a little bit of glazing medium in one of these little tubs. When you lay out your palette, we can open a palette and think, okay, I'm going to put my colors down, and we put them right in the middle. Instead of doing that, that can be a tendency if you're not familiar with painting, keeping in mind that we want to actually retain this whole central area of the palette for mixing colors. So if you lay your colors actually out along the perimeter without getting too close to the edge, because you don't want it to drip down the side of the sponge, but keep it around the edge, you actually can retain a lot of space in the center for color mixing. And as you do lay out the colors, think, even if you're not working with that many colors, still think in a sort of rainbow spectrum, because inevitably these colors are going to meld a little bit together, especially in the fluid acrylics, so they do tend to seep. And having your red and orange seep together is a lot more friendly than having your red and green seep together that are on opposite sides of the color wheel. So keeping the families of colors sort of moving around the palette is going to just make sort of these natural spectral progressions, and it'll just keep your palette a lot cleaner even as it does run together. So I'm going to use a pretty limited palette here, especially as I'm beginning my painting. So what I'm going to use is actually mostly white. So I'm just putting a little bit, remembering buffet mentality, you can always go back for more. So I think of like about the same amount that I would put on a toothbrush or something like that. Just a little dab. I'm going to also use this transparent red oxide. And so this is probably going to be the darkest color that I'm going to be using right off the bat. I'm going to put this in a farther corner away from my white because I really don't want my darker colors to be seeping towards my white. I'm going to use Naples yellow, which has a lot more white in it. And if you look at the back of these little tubes, you can see they have this graph, which can be really handy as you're working in transparencies. You can see this Naples yellow, the opaque versus transparent is all the way almost to the opaque, whereas the red iron oxide that I just used is completely transparent. So it's just a really good way to get to know your pigments and what you're working with, because they're all different. They're all made of different minerals and they behave very differently. So you can see, even though it's only 3 tones, we're working through a spectrum. And maybe a little bit of raw umber. And I'm going to use actually a fair amount of raw umber, especially once we start working into the figure. We're going to talk a lot about gray tones and the raw umber. But for now, I'm just going to put a little bit over here just so that I have it for an accent. So you can see there's mostly space on my palette. I just have these little dollops. They're not right up against the edge. There's just a lot of room to work. And it's not a lot of paint. The more paint I have, the more it's just going to inevitably seep outwards. So just keeping it nice and simple and clean at this point is going to be really helpful moving forward. Also, as you close up your palette for the day, you're going to want to spritz it. So right now these paints are perfect. This paper is nice and wet. I can feel it. The sponge underneath it's wet to the point of dripping, but not full. There's no water sitting in the bottom of this palette. But if I do need to step away, even for lunch or a short amount of time, I'll just give it a little spritz like this, 2 sprays, not directly on it. I don't want to make these really soupy. I just want to dust the top with water and then close it up. And there we go. That'll last well. So that pretty much covers our supplies, and let's talk about the canvas. So when I begin a painting, I really often just begin with the seed of an idea. Sometimes this is a figurative pose, or an animal, or an element, or even an emotion. It's really just a starting point that will take me on the journey of the painting. Along the way, some planning does come in, and so really to me the creative process is a dance between that masculine, feminine, that right brain and left brain. It's the in-breath, out-breath. It's the logic and planning balanced with the intuition and the mystery. And so early in the planning phases, it's a great way to just really tap into that inspiration. And so I do these little thumbnail sketches. These are literally almost the size of a thumbnail. They're like a postage stamp that's going to just really give a basic idea of flow and composition. It might give some concept of light and shadow and just overall what are the main shapes of this painting. And so just starting with a little box, and they can be so simple. They do not need to be beautiful. They can be so simple as to just be an oval with a smiley face. So really allow it to be free. These shouldn't take any more than a minute or two per sketch. And I just really wanted to do some layouts. I originally thought I was going to do my canvas vertical, so these ones I'd drawn vertical, so bear with me. But I just wanted to experiment with a bunch of different layouts. I had no idea necessarily yet what I wanted this concept to be, other than a central composition of a face in sort of the mirror pose where you're looking directly at the figure. So I just went through and experimented with different lines, different movements, and just played into them. I ended up sort of focusing in on this one here, which has some drapery and adornment and an interesting sort of fabric and beads going on, and then realized that I'm actually going to paint it horizontal, so I reframed it and just kept working into it. And so I've developed that sketch a little bit farther here, just to get an idea of, okay, where are these fabrics falling, where are the beads. I'm going to put a horizon line in here and work with a little bit of a graphic element. And still, as this sketch here is much more detailed than the previous sketch, but there's still a lot of room for play and experimentation. And as I go forward on the painting process with this, I really trust that new information will come at the perfect time and will really just feed into the process. And this is one of the great joys of acrylic painting, is that it dries so quickly that you can change your mind drastically in a very short amount of time. And I have been known to do that. Absolutely take leaps of faith and take a painting in a totally different direction, just trusting my intuition and inspiration as it comes. And so I don't try to create a cage for myself here that I need to adhere to this completely. I just really want to play and brainstorm. This is the freest it's going to be, and so I can just get in there and again looking for those bigger shapes of when I blur my eyes and I look at this sketch from a little bit farther away, what are sort of the big shapes that I'm looking at here, and how do I want that to read if it was from across the room or on the internet, like when it's being viewed small. I want that sort of big picture idea, and all the details will come at the perfect time as we move forward. Okay, knowing I'm going to be working with a central composition of a figure, I found a reference that inspires me and I can work from, and have printed it out in both color and black and white. It's a nice clear resolution, and so I have a lot of information there. The clearer the resolution, the more information you have. It doesn't mean you need to use all of that information, but it just means that you don't have to make up what you don't know. So print it nice and big if you can. If you can only print it little, then that's fine too. There's lots of ways to scale up a reference photo to transfer to your canvas, and we'll talk about that. But I just really believe in reference. If you're working in realism, just having that information is so important. Even if you're exaggerating a figure, knowing anatomy is really the foundation of having the freedom to stretch and play and break the rules of anatomy. So really don't be afraid to draw from life, to take photographs. I encourage you to take your own photographs or work with a photographer for your reference photos. So that you know that those photos are going to be high resolution, and also they're not going to be recognizably Cindy Crawford or somebody like that, you know, if you want your painting to be unique, just really take care with your reference photos and you can get a lot of information. And in no way do you then need to adhere to those reference photos. You can stretch and distort and change things as much as you want, but at least you have the information of anatomy, as well as light and shadow and the consistency of that light and shadow. You can also combine a lot of reference photos, and if you're combining reference photos, just really a key to keep in mind is consistency of light source. So say she's going to have a parrot sitting on her shoulder or something like that. Find a photo of a parrot that inspires you. Maybe you have to combine a couple photos of a parrot, but really making sure that that light source is consistent with your original photo reference. So we're going to keep those pretty handy when we start to work later into the figure, and we'll tape them up nice and close so that we can really keep looking at it and trusting that reference. It's going to be a big help to us as we move forward. To begin a painting, sometimes the inertia is incapacitating. You know, there is nothing scarier than a blank white canvas. There's also nothing more exciting. It's just pure potential. We can create worlds on this of anything we can possibly dream. So often I find that the best way to move through that pristine white canvas is actually just to get some paint on it without too much worry about what the finished product is going to be or whether we're even going to retain some of that background color that we're first laying down. It's more just about play. This is the freest we're ever going to be in the painting process. This is also a chance to lay down some darker color that we can work with the white chalk back on top. And it's a way of setting intentions for the painting. It's a way to play and pray into the canvas, really. It's about really embedding in that foundational layer what you're dreaming of for the future, just in a more playful, energetic way. So in order to do so, there's a lot of options. It can be as simple as a very clean, flat coat. It can be a gradation. It can be many, many layers of transparencies and thin coats of dripping colors. You can spray it. You can dab it with sponges or leaves or the plastic like I mentioned before, which I'm going to do. There's a lot of options. You can write things. The main key about this is to keep it very, very thin. And in order to do so, we're going to thin it with water, because what we do want to avoid is any little ridges of paint that are only going to cause texture later that is probably going to be arbitrary to our overall composition. So just keeping in mind as we're working and playing on it, to not let any little ridges build up that are going to cause those issues later. So I'm going to use a nice big brush. Doesn't really matter, you can use a cloth or a sponge. You can use a smaller brush and work into smaller detail as you're swirling around. You can use a bigger brush, but I'm just going to use this 2-inch brush here, and I'm going to again limit my palette. I'm not necessarily sure exactly what my background is going to be for my finished product, but I have an idea of the color scheme I'm going to be working with in the painting. So in order to just start in that direction, I'm just limiting my palette, and I'm going to start mixing those colors with white in order to get the right consistency. So in order to lay down a background texture and color, I've just chosen a very, very simple color palette that I showed before. I've got this raw umber, which is a very dark neutral brown. I've got the red iron oxide, which is a transparent, very orangey, reddish tone. Naples yellow, which is actually quite opaque. It's a nice, it looks very creamy yellow, but as it thins out, it gets more luminous. And then I've got titanium white. I'm going to keep my water nice and handy and use that to mix in so that I can have very, very thin layers of paint. And I could build this up gradually with lots of thin layers of paint, and I really want to avoid texture on the canvas at this point, so water is going to really help that. So I'm just going to dip my brush. You can use various sizes of brushes, but I'm going to dip my brush into the water and pull off a little bit just on the side of the tub so that I'm not mixing too much water in. You can always add more, but I'm just going to start dragging the color in. And as you're pulling color from your piles of paint, try pulling it from the side rather than dipping your brush. With a big brush, it's hard to aim, but in general, try to pull your color from the side of the pool of paint so that you're not tainting the whole pool of paint. You can leave a lot of it quite pristine and just make a nice consistency. Also really sort of swish it around. I don't want any surprises necessarily of unmixed color coming in as I'm pushing it onto the canvas. So I want it to be pretty watery. And as I said, you can build this up over many layers, so it can be really pale, it can be very transparent. The more water you mix in, the more transparent it's going to become, and also the more it's going to play on the surface of the canvas in the way of drips and textures. So really allow it to be really thin and know that you can take your time with this and build up a pretty interesting background before you even get into any of the sketching or figurative work. So we're going to work onto this blank canvas in a really loose and playful way. I've got my color mixed here with lots of water in it, and I'm just going to, breathe and start bringing color onto that canvas. This is a time that you can be really playful. I could write things in here. I could do symbols. I could take it outside in the grass and splash paint on it and, walk across it if I really want to be creative. But I mostly just want to cover up all the white. Maybe I'll work into some darker colors down here. A little bit more paint. And start to create a bit of a gradation, but I don't need it to be fully smooth. It's already, see, there's a lot of water mixed in, so it's able to drip a little bit and just sort of take on its own life and texture. Can also use a spritzer bottle and I'm not pulling it all the way. Maybe I want to just create some splatters. So I can just pull it just a little bit and it just sends little droplets out. And you'll see that those start to form drips. Careful about going overboard on that too quickly, because if you don't see it happening right away, it's tempting to put more water on, and then you'll notice that it all just starts dripping. And pretty soon your canvas is almost washed clean again. So go slow with it, but it's fun to splatter some water on. It's also nice to sometimes let it dry halfway, and you can spray some water on it. It'll create a really interesting texture where it lifts away again. But I just want to create some interest here, some texture and some movement without paying too much attention to the big hopes and dreams I have of this painting. This is more so just allowing it to be loose. And as I mentioned, you can let this dry, and you can do this a number of times. You could take it fully dark if you want. You could paint it black or solid blue or whatever you want. But it is helpful to just play on it. So I've covered up all the white now, and you can use a lot of things to texture. You can get your hands in there and swirl, though if you do so, please be mindful that these pigments, a lot of them are toxic, so really pay attention. Naples yellow, for example, has lead in it. So just being aware, if you get some on your hands, wash your hands after. Cadmiums also, phthalos also, they're toxic pigments. Just because it's a water-based acrylic paint doesn't mean it's not toxic. So really being mindful of that is helpful. I'm going to use this plastic here that I mentioned earlier. This was actually the plastic that wrapped the canvas. And I'm just going to actually do, it's called the Calcomania, and I'm just going to lay it onto this wet paint. Just squish it on there. Now you can actually work flat, get this very watery, and lay it onto the canvas and actually let it dry for a little while before you peel it up, and it will create crisper and crisper shapes. But right now I just want to create a little bit more texture, and I don't mind that it's still really wet, so it's going to soften all those textures as I lift it away. It really is just fun and creates, if you're doing stone or some sort of really organic texture, if this is all going to be some sort of riverbed or something like that, this is a great way, or like mountain cliff faces, it's a great way to get those sort of organic shapes without having to try to paint them all meticulously. Often when we're painting by hand, we're wanting to smooth everything and make it really even and consistent, whereas this creates a lot of randomness. I'm also keeping in mind that my composition is a central figure here, so I'm not paying a lot of attention necessarily to this whole central area. I see that I've missed a couple little spots on the white. I know that this face is going to cover it, so I'm not getting too hung up on it, but I do want that texture to come fully across regardless of what's in my foreground, so that it creates a consistency of the background. This is the easiest it's ever going to be to create consistency in background. As soon as you bring in a figure into the foreground, you're going to have to paint around it if you want to paint that background. And then more and more so, as you have little tendrils of hair or little details sticking up, you're going to have to paint around all of those little details. So thinking as if you're building a house, the easiest time to make sure your foundation is flat is before you put the walls on, and especially before you hang pictures on the walls. So really thinking from the ground up, we're building something here. So working in that background farthest away first, and we're going to work our way forward and forward, general to specific, and this whole process is based on general to specific. Okay, so I've been waiting for my canvas to dry, and with acrylic paint, depending on the atmosphere, the humidity, whether you're inside or out, and the temperature, it can dry very quickly. But I definitely want to make sure that my background is dry, and while I've been waiting, my palette's just been sitting open, and you can see that this is still very, very wet. This is the joy of the Stay Wet palette, is that there is a lot of water still wicking up through because that sponge is so damp underneath and that paper allows it to come up through. So as I'm moving forward now, I'm actually not going to be using the yellows and the red oxide anymore. At this point, I'm just going to be using white and raw umber. So I can use a paper towel and actually just wipe away a lot of this excess paint. I could also just take this to the sink and just rinse this whole paper. Just peel it out and rinse it off, which is a really efficient way to go. I'm not going to get too hung up on this being absolutely pristine. You'll notice that it does stain the paper, but it's still very, very usable. And I'm just going to get rid of a lot of these sort of yellow tones so that I can work on top with my gray tones. There. So you can see it still looks sort of yellow, but mostly that paint is gone. All right, so my canvas is dry now, dry to the touch, I can feel. So I know that I can safely draw on top and not affect this underlayer. And you see that I've put a few more layers of paint on top and let them dry in between and created a little bit more of a smooth, hazy surface. I'm still going to work quite a bit into this background. Like I said, I'm not really sure where the background is going to inevitably end up, but at this point I know that I generally want it to be this sort of creamy, peachy yellow color, and I sort of like these textures, so I'm just going to leave them at this point, but I have toned the canvas so that I can work in white chalk, and you'll see that working in white chalk you can literally draw on there, and then using a damp cloth, just one of these cotton cloths, I can wipe away really easily. So it's going to be very useful in the brainstorming phase as well as the laying out phase of the actual figure. I have my reference photo here off to the side, nice and handy, and like I said, it's blown up pretty good to a pretty good size. I think I'm actually going to be working pretty much at this size, which is an ideal if you can print it that big, to print it to the size that you're going to be painting. However, if that's not possible, or if you just don't, that's not the size you have, it's fine. Really, even a photo on your phone can give you enough information to work by. And in order to transfer that small photo big on your canvas, it's the same technique that somebody would use to transfer a small photo and make it big on a wall for a mural. There's a number of ways to do that, and that can be anywhere from eyeballing it and just sketching it and using your drawing skills in that way and really honing your eye, all the way through to gridding, a very basic grid or a complex grid, which is working just in squares. It's absolutely imperative that they are squares, but as long as there's squares on your canvas and squares on your photo, you know that that ratio will transfer, and you can make a very small picture very, very large just by trusting each individual little box as you're working your way around the grid. You can also, some people project or trace. It's really, there's no wrong way to do this. There's a lot of talk around what is, what's cheating or not. I really encourage you to just check in with yourself. Use the tools that are available to you, and also trust your own conscience. If you want to push yourself, then go with the more challenging option of eyeballing or gridding, because knowing that that's only going to build your drawing skills, rather than creating crutches with some of like the tracing techniques, which are totally logical too, and especially if you're going for a likeness, that's totally fine. But if you do that, you won't be necessarily building the exact same skills as you would be from eyeballing it like you would in life drawing. I really believe that life drawing is such a good practice. So just find what works for you. Absolutely, there's a lot of different ways to get your image from the reference or from your sketch onto your canvas and just find what works for you. I'm just going to eyeball it, but I am going to, because I'm going to be working at the same size as my reference photo, I'm going to just take some measurements of her face and to place it on here working in chalk. All right, so I've prepared my very basic drawing here. I haven't gotten into any details yet. This is all just incredibly general. So I haven't done any details of nostrils or eyelids or any little nuances. It's just big picture stuff, and really taken my time to make sure that I have it centered on the canvas and that all the proportions are in right ratio to each other and laid out. I've also roughed in this outer area of the cloak and the headdress just in a really sort of basic way. So now as I start into the paint, I'm going to actually work in gray tones. There's a lot of different ways you can approach painting with acrylic, and especially when it comes to painting the figure, you can work with skin tones right in alla prima. You can work with light on dark or dark on light and then glaze. There's so many different ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work with gray tones that is made of raw umber and titanium white. And this is going to give a nice neutral warm gray to build the sculpture of the form, which I'll then bring glazes in on top of transparencies to tint that form. So really, in working with acrylic, we need to sort of accept the fact that it dries fast. You know, so often we want to blend wet into wet, especially if you're more used to oil paints. Really, a lot of the frustration around acrylic comes with the fact that it dries so quickly. So we're going to work with that and actually use that to our advantage. And in doing so, we just need to approach it from a little bit different of a direction. And that comes more into working very, very general to specific in a gradual way. So I want to work pretty quickly at first, deliberate but quick, and in order to do so, I need to think big picture. And so in order to do that, I want to choose a brush that is going to be really efficient and that's not going to actually allow me to get into the little minutia of the form. So often I'll actually hold a brush to the painting and say, well, this is going to be a little bit too big, a little bit too small. Maybe I'm going to start wanting to get into details too soon. So this is my Goldilocks size here. I think that's going to be perfect. So if you work with as big of a brush as possible, as late into the process as possible, it's going to really help retain that big picture without getting into all these little details too quickly, which will inevitably flatten your image. I really want to retain a lot of the form that is going to develop in these early stages. And so in order to do that, I need to think very broadly. And in looking at my reference now, I can start to really pull out the general shapes of the highlights and shadows. I'm working at the beginning here, I'm working with the black and white image, because if I'm working with the color image, I'm getting hung up on warms and cools and the subtle variations of skin tone around her face. And instead of thinking of it very much more in black and white and shades of gray in between, I really want to think of her as a sculpture before I get into painting that sculpture. So I'm going to work in, at the beginning, in a very general highlight and a general shadow. I'm not going to touch anything that's like too white. I'm going to really retain those brightest brights and the darkest darks for much later in the painting. At this point, I really just want to find the general highlights and general shadows. So if I was to make a decision about this painting, and if you're familiar with Photoshop, there's a technique called posterizing. So if I'm imagining I'm posterizing this image, which is really just dividing the tone fields into like very clean borders. If I'm going to posterize this image in my mind, where would the border lie between the general shadow and the general highlight? And I can help that by softening my gaze. So in order to do so, I'm just relaxing my focus and looking with a blurred vision at her. If you have glasses, take off your glasses. It's going to really help you see the big picture without getting hung up on all the little details. It's so tempting to just get in there and paint eyelashes right off the bat. It's so fun to do all the little details, but we really need to just think big picture at this point. So as I mentioned before, and I'll say it again and you're going to notice really, acrylic is lighter when it's wet and it will dry darker. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to actually just work generally lighter than I otherwise want it, knowing that it's going to dry to a slightly darker tone. Also, we're going to be working in many, many layers of transparent glazes on top of this gray figure that we're building up. And in order to do so, we want to have it extra bright so that when we put these transparent glazes on, it has somewhere to push that color, because even the brightest yellow transparent glaze is still going to darken white. So if you imagine a pane of stained glass, a yellow pane of stained glass is still darker than a transparent one. So it's always, the glazing process is always going to darken what's underneath, and we really want to keep it light. So I'm just going to mix a very neutral general highlight color and a neutral general shadow color. These shadows are pretty strong. These shadows along here, this is quite dark. So I can take it pretty extreme, but I do want to keep it lighter than I see it at this point. And I'm just going to mix those two colors. So say 25% if you have a scale of 1 to 100 from pure white to pure black. I'm going to mix like a 25% light and a 75% dark, just so that I have those basic shadows and highlights. You can even come in with your chalk and give yourself a little bit of guideline of where would I let that border lie if I had to make a distinction between light and shadow on her face. If you really want to train your eye, you can even posterize it on Photoshop, or lay a piece of plastic over top of your reference and actually take a Sharpie marker and draw, because it might seem like a very smooth transition, but really there is a shape to it. So I'm looking for the shape of this highlight and the shape of this shadow, and as we transfer it over here, I'm going to be very bold with that, not paying at all attention to trying to blend wet into wet. So it doesn't matter whether you start with the shadows or the highlights. I'm just going to start with the shadows here and just start to cut those in a very bold way. Now, because these are thin paints, you're probably going to see some of your background color show from underneath, and don't worry about it. There's going to be a lot more layers on top. Right now I'm just blocking. So I see that shadow wraps right around under her lip, and then it pretty much is this whole upper lip. So there might be a little bit of highlight within an area of shadow, or a little bit of shadow within an area of highlight, and right now I really just want to ignore all those tiny little details and really look for the bigger shapes. A lot of the time, if there's a 3/4 or a half lighting here coming from the side, you're going to actually see that one side of the face is just almost all shadow, maybe with a general highlight just touching here, and this is all in light. So being that bold is going to really help sculpt. If you think of this as a carving, say we're doing a chainsaw carving and we have a massive piece of wood, we need to get in with that chainsaw and be very bold and just cut away huge pieces of wood. And then we come in with chisels and to start to take away smaller little pieces. And then we come in with little rasps and maybe a Dremel tool, and we get into smaller and smaller little tools in order to bring the detailing in. And when we have that nice and smooth, then we paint our sculpture. So that's really the way we're working here. We're working very general, and we're going to get into all the details, and then we're going to paint it after and tint all the color with glazes. So at this point I can just be very bold with it. I'm not trying to feather these lines out, but I do want to make sure that if I look from an angle, I'm not seeing any ridges of paint that are going to dry and become a nuisance later. So keep your layers nice and even. You can go in and make them a little bit more solid if you find they're a little bit too transparent, but just really being bold and deliberate. I see that this is pretty much all the way shadow, so I'm just going to bring it down while retaining a little bit of that line of the chin that I got in my sketch. And that's pretty much it. Really a lot of her face is in light, so that's going to come in with the highlights. So general highlights, just blocking it. So with acrylics, in order to get a nice smooth finish and nice soft gradations and round forms, a lot of it comes with layering. And this is a way that I've really been able to get those smooth gradations by starting very general like this and then working into smaller and smaller areas. And really with that idea of posterizing, we're actually creating a bit of an optical illusion where there's a lot of different shades stacked up against each other, and when you step back you actually see a really smooth transition, but when you look closely you can see that there's a lot of different shades making up that transition. I see that this one came a little too far, so I'm just going to bring that back over. Bring it right across. All right. So once you have just that very basic loose general highlight and shadow, we can start to work into a slightly smaller brush. And looking back at the reference, if I was to now pick a third tone or a third shade, where would those borders lie? So I'm seeing this general highlight here and the general shadow here. And then if I just relax my eyes a little bit more, I can see that there's actually a third shade that runs between the two, and I call that a bridge tone. So that follows down here. I see that actually almost this whole cheek is made up of that third shade. It's not actually the brightness of this side of the face, and it comes down on this side of the lip, this upper lip. It's up here a little bit, and you can just follow around and say, okay, well, what are the shapes of that third bridge tone? And you can mix that color by mixing the two colors that you've already been using, or just eyeball it. Again, if your painting is dry here, this is going to dry darker than the wet paint you have on your palette. So it does take a little bit of eyeballing and knowing that it's going to dry darker. So you're always going to be mixing slightly lighter. This is just one of the annoying things of acrylic paint. Get used to it. We're all just, you figure it out, and sometimes it's a bit of trial and error. But we're going to mix that color pretty close, and you can do a little test. Just do it somewhere that's not too precious. Okay, I think I can go a little lighter than that. And so this bridge tone is not going to just obediently follow this border all the way down like that. It's actually going to take on its own shape. It's another whole plane that's making up the form of this face. So I really want to keep checking my reference. When you're doing life drawing, they say you should be looking at the model 80% of the time and the drawing 20% of the time. And not that you need to go to that extreme when you're painting, but it's a good thing to keep in mind of checking and checking and checking your reference so that we never take for granted what we think it is. Otherwise, it's easy to jump to conclusions and assume, I know what a nose looks like, and you paint, you know, an upside down mushroom and you think you know what a nose looks like. But really, to just look at that reference and to trust the shapes. Don't look at it as a face. Look at it as a solid object made up of shapes. And so try to find those shapes within the larger form, and it's going to give you a lot more realism. Sometimes just truly trusting your reference is going to give you greater results than thinking that, you know, you can assume you know what that is actually, what's actually there. So I'm just going to follow around and bring in that third tone. I see that it actually falls this whole under area here. Upper lip. Down around this whole cheek. So these bridge tones, just like a bridge going over a river, it's suspended on either side of the land. So I'm actually, as I'm bringing it around, I'm going partially over the general shadows that I've done and partially over the general highlights. So it's bridging the two by actually covering up portions of each of them and sometimes creating new little values like islands in the middle of them. See that that one's going to need a little bit more shadow there. So you can go in and touch up as you go. And then just start working in smaller and smaller bridges. You might need to move to a smaller brush, or working in certain areas you might need to use a smaller brush, or go back to the big brush. If you feel like you lose that overall form, sometimes just cutting in those big shapes again can be really helpful. It's just about working that general to specific and really try to keep that big picture while creating nuances and subtleties on that overall shape. Okay, so I've brought all of the skin now to a general maybe 75% refined level. As you're working with this blocking and bridging, when you start to get into some of these smaller areas, you're actually able to work more wet into wet. And just by changing your brush stroke and going more into little dabs, it does create a bit of an optical illusion of smoothness, which can give the effect of those really sweet gradual gradations rather than broad strokes of wet into wet with acrylic, which is really challenging to get unless you're working incredibly fast. This is a technique of moving slower and really just taking your time and creating that little bits of subtle shifts of light and shadow which allow the form to wrap smoothly. I even move to a round brush and start to work in some of these more detailed areas and just pushing and pulling and refining these areas until they get to a level that I feel like I can add transparencies over of glazes, and it'll only accentuate what the work I've done underneath. A lot of the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows are going to come in the glazing phase, so I don't need to really pop those extremes at this point. I'm still working pretty neutral, but in general I am keeping the overall painting lighter than I inevitably want it, so that as I'm glazing I can have somewhere to push those colors, and it'll darken it substantially. So just leaving room for that darkening by keeping it a little lighter is going to help create a lot more variation and dynamic lighting. So I've left the eyes just blank at this point, and we can treat them pretty individually. They don't need to have a lot of the same glazing aspects done to them. They really are sort of isolated on the figure. So we can move to them now before we may start to work into the glazing, so that we can tie in a lot of the same colors as we're working later. And to base the eyes, it's like really to imagine the eyeball is a ball. It's not an almond. It's so tempting to want to paint these eyeballs as little almond shapes like this, but really if we can remember that it's an eyeball in a socket, and so a lot of those brush strokes can actually go more vertical, still curving around the roundness of the ball, but just really remembering that as you're blocking it in. And again, with eyes, I work general to specific. So first I'm going to block in the whites of the eyes, and then the iris, and then the pupil, and then the light dot on top. And as I go, I'm going to be still dancing back and forth between them, but I really want to bring each one of those aspects up to a certain refined level before I move to the next, because it's never going to get easier to get this whites of the eyes nice and round looking than it is now. So I've mixed the same gray background color, but with a little bit of blue. So this is the raw umber, titanium white, and a tiny bit of Payne's gray, just to blue it out so that the whites of the eyes have that cool tone underneath. So a little bit more shade, and really looking at your reference of where is the light hitting, where is it, where are the whites of the eyes darker, and where do they curve around and hit the light. Generally, the whites of the eyes are a lot darker than we assume they are. We call them whites of the eyes, but they're really more of a blue-gray with some flecks of pink and red in there. So pushing them farther back, and this goes like when you're sketching as well, it can be tempting to just leave the whites of the eyes untouched. But if you actually gray them out to a pretty big extent, you'll notice that they sink back into the eye sockets a lot and really help bring dimension into the eyes. So I'm just going to push that. I'm seeing in my reference that It's actually very dark into here. Before I've moved to this, I have checked with a ruler to make sure that each one of these eyes is an equal distance, because this is a front symmetrical view. I want to make sure that the eyes are an equal distance from the center line and an equal distance apart as they are wide, just to really make sure that they're all in the right place before I start to paint and put a lot of work into refining them. It definitely happens sometimes that later in the painting process you notice that something is actually very distorted, and that can be a chain reaction of just the difference of painting up one little brush stroke and then refining that up, and it can really creep up easily. So taking your time at this stage is going to actually save a lot of time later in the process. So really give it the attention it deserves. Also paying attention to the shape of the eyes. So I see that this one is very dark. This is the shadow side of the face, and it really sinks away. So because this is such a small area, even with the acrylic, I'm able to work a little bit of wet into wet, which helps get a nice smooth transition. But I'm not getting too hung up on it being absolutely smooth, knowing that I can go in and bridge those easily and I can keep refining it. Dropping a nice shadow underneath the thickness of that upper eyelid. Really thinking about the eyelids as if you have a grapefruit and you cut a slice of the peel away. Think about the thickness of that is actually going to cast a shadow. And again, it's just going to sink it into the socket of the eye and really give realism and dimension. Depending on the perspective of the face, often you can see a little bit of that lower lid, and this can still come into some of the refining later when we start to work in the glazing, but I can really use this opportunity to pay attention to the curvature of that lower lid and where you can see across the thickness of it, where it might be catching the light and reflecting. Just beware that there is a little bit of blue mixed in there, so I don't want to get carried away and bring blue all the way across the face. But I'm just sort of moving around. It's nice with acrylic because it does dry fast. Just getting in the habit of sort of moving around the canvas and not getting myopic about one area. It's nice to let each spot dry a little bit. If you're finding that you're working into an area and you're actually pulling up the paint from underneath and creating sort of holes in the gradation, it's that the paint underneath is not quite dry. So really just letting that dry, and you'll find that probably if you get into the habit of just moving around quite a bit, being mindful of the back of your hand if you want to use a maul stick, or just keep track of where you've worked and where it's likely to be wet. But that really is going to give each area a chance to dry so that you can work back on top in confidence that you're not going to be reactivating that uncured paint underneath. Also, when you're working on eyes, and really any part of the face, if you're working on this cheekbone, then work on this cheekbone, or especially with the eyes though. If you're working on one eye, bring them both up to the same level. Don't just go into one eye, bring it to completion, and then move over, because chances are when you come back to the second one, it's going to be a different time of the day. The weight of your hand is going to be different. Your attention is going to be different. And it's really ideal to move the areas, each sort of matching area, forward at the same pace. I find when I'm working in installments in a painting, I actually bring a whole level of something to completion before I finish. So if I'm going to finish painting for the day, I might finish all of the flower petals or all of the fabric lines or something like that, just to really know that they're all going to belong in the same world and have relationships to each other. It can be really hard to match otherwise. Okay. So I feel like that's pretty round looking, and again, I can get in and refine it a little later if need be, but at least there's sort of an evenness to it. And so the irises are often smaller than we assume they are. They, at a relaxed gaze, they usually are going to be tucked about a quarter up underneath the upper eyelid and then come down to meet the lower lid. And that does change severely even with the slight angle of the face, so pay attention to that, and in your reference really observe it and find out where they need to be. But they fill approximately half of the whites of the eyes in their width, but that half is centered if it's looking straight forward. So keeping that in mind as you block in the irises, beware of going too big. I'm just going to use a little bit bluer version of the whites that I've done in the eyes here so far. Those are looking very blue. I might still gray them out a little bit more. But I'm just going to, you can use a pencil or something very precise. You can use the Stabilo pen just to draw in if you need to, but I'm just gonna, no pun intended, eyeball it. Okay, maybe I intended it a little bit. But I'm just gonna block those in sort of a neutral dark. And really get them nice and round before I move forward. I'm seeing in my reference that because her head is tipped slightly back and her eyes are closed a little bit relaxed, they do come down and tuck ever so slightly under those lower lids as well. Around the outer part of the iris, it tends to be substantially darker than the inner area, so I can start to accentuate that now. Just bringing in that nice dark outer ring. But this is your painting. You can do whatever you want. You can make them purple or glowing or whatever color you want. I'm just going to make them sort of neutral, dark blue-gray. Again, that upper eyelid is casting a shadow. However, the iris is actually concave inside of the convex eyeball. So it's sitting like a bowl inside the eyeball, so therefore catching more shadow even than the whites of the eyes. So really just pushing that shadow a little bit farther down is going to help sink it into the eyeball. It's a little smaller. So you can use a ruler or just pay attention. Make sure that those irises are the same size. Very important. They say the eyes are the windows to the soul, and eyes are the first point of contact. When you meet somebody and you shake their hand, you look in their eyes. And so when we meet a painting and there are eyes to look in, that is our first point of contact. That's our point of entry for the painting. So really give the eyes the attention they deserve, and know that that's going to be a bit of a vortex for people to enter that painting, and they'll come back. They'll keep coming back to the eyes. So don't rush it. Really take your time with it and make sure that they're the same size and that they're nice and refined to a level that you're happy with them. Because if they're slightly off, it can be unnerving and we don't necessarily know why, but you really want those eyes to be clean and clear. Also make sure if it's focused at the viewer, you can cover one and make sure, is she looking at you? Cover the other. Okay, is she looking? This one feels like it's a little higher. So you can just nudge that down ever so slightly. Just keep working it. Also around the outer part of the iris, where it transitions into the white, because that iris is sitting inside, slightly inside of the eyeball, the whites actually come and cover ever so slightly around the edge. So there's quite a haziness around the outside of the iris here. So I'm actually using the bridge concept, and I'm mixing a color halfway between this color and this color, and just running it around the perimeter. And it might take, depending on the size of your painting, it might take like 3 of these bridges just to really haze out that outer area. But it's going to also really help to sink those irises back into the eyeball. I'm leaving room for the tear ducts. I haven't got into those because they have quite a pinkness to them. So I'm just going to let them be for now, but knowing that they need to have space left for them, so I'm not going to be shading right over into this almond area. I'm really remembering that this is a ball. Just little dabs. Really experiment with the brush strokes and find the brush stroke that works for you and works for the area of painting the painting that you're working on. It really depends on what you're going for, and sometimes longer strokes, sometimes little dabs actually will give you more of the effect that you want, almost working impressionistically, but on such a small level that it looks smooth as soon as you get back a little bit. And in general, stepping back from your painting is such a good practice. Try to get in the habit of it. It also can be a good opportunity to stretch your body and take care of it. Okay, so the irises, if you look closely, they tend to be a little bit of a starburst, or if you've ever seen a solar eclipse, they look a lot like that. There's the darker ring around the outside, and then there's this bright burst of light. Even on very dark eyes, you can still pick that up, though the darker the eyes, the more subtle it is, so you don't need to push it really far on dark eyes, but it's fun to even just lay that in, even if you know that the eyes are going to be quite dark, just to give some little impression of that starburst. And just fan some little brush strokes outwards. Can give that texture. Don't make them too consistent. Nature is not laser precision, it's organic, but it is balanced, so just try to make them nice and even. You can go right over where you think that pupil is going to be so that you have a nice consistent burst. And again, play with this. Take it as fantastical as you want to take it. Make them whatever color, or kaleidoscope, or do little mandala design in there, or whatever you want. And if you build it up with transparencies, now I can work in a little bit of that blue, a little clearer, and I'm going to mix in a little bit of that glazing medium that we talked about earlier, the Liquitex glazing medium, which is, it dries transparent. So I'm just going to mix a little bit of that into my blue, along with a little bit of water, and then I can bring that transparency over top. And you can see it starts to tint it and push it back. And you can do that many times, just let it dry in between and really start to push that back. But depending on the color scheme of your overall painting, you might want to bring like flecks of yellow and gold, or red, or any other colors into it. So maybe I will actually. I'm going to mix some of my background colors. This sort of peachy color. And I can just bring in some little flecks of that into the iris as well. especially right around the pupil, there tends to be a sort of gold color often, especially on blue, green, or hazel eyes, brown as well. There's often this rusty gold right tucked in around the pupil, and it tends to be quite a bit brighter. So I'm going to really accentuate that. Again, the same way that I worked lighter on the face, I'm lightening the irises quite a bit. And I'm not paying too much mind to where that pupil is going to sit, but I'm lightening it up so that I can work in the transparencies on top and have somewhere to push it. So maybe a little bit more the reddish tone. Just little dabs, and try to keep it pretty random so that it's not just an even, predictable burst. Just want there to be some movement and play in there. Some Naples yellow. It's nice and opaque, so I can use that to bring in some of that texture. I can work back into the blue. Payne's Gray. Payne's Gray is a really nice neutral blue. Although every brand of Payne's Gray I've noticed is very different. Some of them, sometimes they're very neutral and gray, and other times, like this golden fluid Payne's Gray is actually very blue. So I'm using that just sort of as my main blue here. Just letting that gold color dry a little bit so that I can bring some glaze over top of it. So working with that transparency, it's just in very, very thin layers. So I could build this up many times and it's just going to create more and more dimension. So again, just take your time and build up some texture. So the irises, because they are this concave shape embedded into the eyeball, when the light, if the light is coming from this direction, it's actually going to be hitting the opposite side of the whites of the eyes. It's going to be hitting sort of the inside. If you imagine it like a shallow bowl, it's actually going to be hitting this side. So I'm just going to bring a little bit more highlight over onto that far side, which is going to really help give that glassy depth. This is just sort of a mix of the blue and the rusty colors and the Naples yellow. Just to start to sort of brown it out a little bit. Often by the time I've finished the eyes, I've gone back and forth between highlighting and glazing color back in on top. I've maybe done that 10 times because every layer is just going to add more and more depth and interest and magic into the eyes. So I really give it a lot of focus. So that's probably good at this point. As you're doing these starbursts, just really be mindful of where the center of that iris is actually going to be. If it's tucked up underneath that upper lid, or if she's looking off in some direction, the center of the irises are going to move. So it's not centered between the lids, it's actually centered in the middle of that larger iris round. This one's a little bit high, but I haven't gotten into the pupils yet. So just really, as you're bringing those starbursts out, try to make sure that they're well centered. So the pupils adjust in size, and this is, something that we can use to create emotion in a painting, because when you have big pupils, if you think of like those little stuffed animals that you see at the store that have the huge eyes, or in cartoons they use it all the time where the pupils just dilate and become massive. This is a way of creating a friendly look. It becomes cute and friendly and warm and open when a pupil just goes down to a needle point, it becomes focused and often sort of mean or has a negative emotion around it. So you can use that to your advantage depending on what mood you want to create in your painting. Depending on your reference photo, the pupils may or may not be dilated. So you can adjust them. You don't need to follow your reference photo completely. You can really just make them as big or as small as you want. Also, it creates, so because it does depend on light, if there's a lot of light in your painting, the pupils might look a little bit smaller because the irises contract in order to block out the light. Whereas if you're in a dark room, they're going to open. But because they are also affected by our emotion, this is a really interesting experiment to do, is look in the mirror and watch your emotion as you stare at your pupils, and you can actually open and close them based on the emotion in your body. So it's really a good place to start of imagining, well, what is the mood I want to create in this painting? Do I want it to be welcoming, or do I want it to have sort of a sinister look? Is this a villain? Is this who is it? And what are they thinking and what are they feeling? And you can use that to create an overall mood. I usually just opt for something a little bit big, but not enormous, just to give a friendly look, but not to make it some Care Bear stare kind of feel. So again, make sure they're round, make sure they're centered, and make sure they're the same size. And I've just mixed some Payne's Gray and raw umber. And this is going to create pretty much the darkest dark that I'm going to need. This is going to be my black, which you can create really with any dark warm and dark cool mixed together. They neutralize and they create a really nice, rich and interesting black that, in comparison to the rest of your canvas, this is going to be one of the darkest areas. So it's all the black you need, really. You can use black, and black can be really useful in different instances, but it's really not needed at this point. And so you can see that with a couple layers of that, that becomes very dark. Oh, and I've gone a little bit outside my round. I know that I can come in and tuck some of those gold colors in around again. I can use some more of my peachy gold colors mixed with a little extra white. Anytime you mix white into a paint, it's going to become more opaque. So it can be used to fix up little areas, or if you need to cover up a dark color, just mixing a little bit of white is going to help you get good coverage. Depending on how many cups of coffee you had, you might find you're a little shaky and you got to go back and forth a few times, and that's fine. Just really give it the attention it deserves and make sure they're nice and round and that they're the same size. And it doesn't take much to nudge it back into round. You don't need to do a full ring or anything, just round it out in any little corners that pop up. Now that I see, I can just lighten that up a little bit. Alright, so this is all pretty dry, and I can keep working into the irises back and forth quite a bit and really bring out the rich colors. But at this point, I've delayed gratification of adding the sparkle of the eye because I really want to build that roundness of the eyeball and the colors of the iris underneath. But really a lot of where the spirit comes in, at this point, it's sort of a deadened gaze. There's no light in the eyes, and that reflection is really what creates the spirit. It's one of the funnest parts of the whole painting, I think, and just adds the magic. Now, depending on your reference, you might have multiple light sources going on, so you might have lights reflected all over, or you might be able to barely see the lights. So to a certain extent, you can make this up and just interpret it, knowing that my light source is coming from over on this direction. I know that the light is going to fall roughly around here on each of the eyes. And I don't want to overdo this. Really, it's tempting because it's so gratifying to put sparkly lights all over the eyes. But just like, you know, a garnish on a food dish or sparkles on the ocean of the moonlight reflecting, there's a specialness when it's rarefied. So if you can keep it sparse, it actually creates more magic than if you add too much to it. It sort of becomes less special the more there is. So I really want to be reserved about it, but add enough that it really gives some magic. I'm going to start with just a grayish white. It's pretty bright, but I don't want to go to my fullest bright white yet. And it's going to probably fall right over top of that transition between those two, of the iris and the pupil. This one might be slightly smaller or darker because it's on the shadow side of the face, but they're going to be generally in the same placement on the eye and the same shape. And you could, you know, maybe I'll just add a second little one here going across. So with that same grayed out white, it's almost pure white but not quite, that we used in the light up here. Also, depending on the moisture in the eyes, there's often a bright reflection of where the light hits the water sitting in the eyes. If you're doing a crying figure, for instance, that water is going to be higher up. It's going to be more noticeable, whereas if the eyes are dry, it's going to be lower down and tighter to the eyelid. But really adding just even the touch of that, again, don't go overboard with it. Don't just drag that highlight all the way across. Really let it be a special, rare thing, but bringing a little bit of that reflection across is going to bring it to life a lot and add some light into the corners of the eyes here and some magic and really help them look glassy. You can use some pure titanium white here. Use it sparingly by just dropping that into those original highlights here. Just really let that sparkle.